Margaret Williams stood at the edge of the parking lot, smoothing down her navy blue dress with trembling hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Command Base in Coronado, California. At 52, she had weathered many storms in her life, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her son Danny was graduating from basic underwater demolition/SEAL training today, and she wouldn't miss it for the world. The butterflies in her stomach had nothing to do with nervousness about the ceremony. Margaret had faced much worse than a military graduation. 25 years ago, she had been a different person entirely. Back then, she went by the name Rosa Martinez, and her life revolved around the East Side Kings, one of Los Angeles' most notorious gangs. The small rose tattoo on her wrist, now faded but still visible, was the only remaining evidence of that dark chapter. Margaret walked through the security checkpoint, showing her ID to the young Marine guard who smiled politely and waved her through. She had arrived early, wanted to find a good spot to watch her son receive his trident pin. The ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but she needed time to compose herself. This day represented everything she had worked toward since leaving Los Angeles all those years ago. The path to the ceremony area wound through perfectly manicured grounds. Palm trees swayed gently in the ocean breeze, and she could hear the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Other families were beginning to arrive, most of them looking far more comfortable in this military environment than she felt. Margaret noticed how confidently they moved, how easily they spoke with the personnel they encountered. She wondered if any of them had stories like hers. Finding an empty bench near the ceremony grounds, Margaret sat down and pulled out her phone to check the time. 9:15. She had 45 minutes before the ceremony began. As she waited, her mind drifted back to the conversation she had with Danny 3 months ago when he called to tell her about his upcoming graduation. "Mom, I know this is a lot to ask," Danny had said, his voice crackling through the phone connection. "The drive from Phoenix is long, and I know you hate crowds, but would you consider coming to my graduation?" Margaret had felt tears spring to her eyes immediately. "Danny, of course I'll be there. I wouldn't miss this for anything in the world. I just want you to know how much everything you did for me means," he had continued. "None of this would have been possible without you." Those words still echoed in her mind as she sat on the bench. Danny had no idea how much his success meant to her, how his achievements had given her life purpose and meaning beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. Margaret's transformation had begun when Danny was just 3 years old. She had been living in East Los Angeles, trapped in a cycle of violence and poverty that seemed impossible to escape. Her involvement with the East Side Kings had started when she was 16, drawn in by promises of protection and belonging. For 9 years, that life had been all she knew. The turning point came during a drive-by shooting that left her best friend Maria dead and Margaret critically injured. As she lay in a hospital bed, looking at her sleeping son who had been staying with her mother, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She was going to get out, no matter what it took. The first step had been witness protection. The FBI had been trying to build a case against the East Side Kings for years, and Margaret had witnessed enough to help them succeed. In exchange for her testimony, they provided her and Danny with new identities and relocation to Phoenix, Arizona. Rosa Martinez died that day, and Margaret Williams was born. Starting over in Phoenix with a 3-year-old child and no job skills beyond what she had learned on the streets proved more challenging than Margaret had anticipated. The government assistance only lasted for the first 6 months, and then she was on her own. She worked 3 jobs during Danny's early years, cleaning office buildings at night, serving breakfast at a diner in the morning, and watching neighbors' children in the afternoon. Margaret never spoke to Danny about their life in Los Angeles. As far as he knew, his father had died when he was very young, and they had moved to Phoenix for better opportunities. She created elaborate stories about his father being a construction worker who died in an accident, giving Danny a hero to admire rather than the truth about his father being a gang member who disappeared when he learned Margaret was pregnant. Education became Margaret's obsession. She enrolled in community college night classes when Danny started kindergarten, determined to build a better life for both of them. It took her 8 years to earn her bachelor's degree in social work, attending classes after her day jobs, and studying while Danny did his homework at the kitchen table. Danny grew up watching his mother's relentless pursuit of self-improvement. He saw her exhaustion, her determination, and her unwavering commitment to providing him with opportunities she never had. When other kids complained about their mother's expectations, Danny felt only gratitude. He understood, even as a child, that his mother was giving everything she had to ensure his success. The military had appealed to Danny from an early age. Margaret initially felt panicked when he expressed interest in joining the Navy, knowing the dangers involved. But she also recognized that the structure, discipline, and honor of military service represented everything she had tried to instill in him. When he told her he wanted to try out for the SEALs, she supported him completely while privately terrifying herself with worry. SEAL training had been even more grueling than Danny anticipated. The physical demands were crushing, but the mental challenges proved even more difficult. There were nights when he called Margaret, exhausted and questioning whether he had what it took to complete the program. During those conversations, Margaret drew on every ounce of strength she had developed during her own transformation. "Danny, listen to me," she would say during his darkest moments. "You come from a long line of survivors. Your strength runs deeper than you know. When you feel like quitting, remember that you're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing it for every dream we built together at that kitchen table." Margaret never told him exactly what she meant by a long line of survivors, but somehow Danny understood. His mother had overcome something significant to give him the life he had, and honoring that sacrifice meant pushing through his own challenges. As Margaret sat on the bench watching other families gather for the ceremony, she thought about the conversation she and Danny had the night before his final training exercise. He had called her, his voice filled with excitement and nervousness. "Mom, tomorrow's the big day. If I make it through tomorrow, I'll officially be a SEAL." "When you make it through tomorrow," Margaret had corrected him. "Not if, when. I love you, Mom. I know I don't say enough, but everything I am, everything I've accomplished, it's because of you." Margaret had cried after hanging up the phone, not from sadness, but from overwhelming pride and gratitude. The scared young woman who had fled Los Angeles 25 years ago could never have imagined that her son would become a Navy SEAL. Now, sitting in the California sunshine, waiting for Danny's graduation ceremony, Margaret felt the weight of her journey settling around her like a comfortable blanket. She had spent so many years looking over her shoulder, afraid that her past would somehow catch up with her and destroy the new life she had built. But time had proven that Margaret Williams was real, that the transformation was complete and permanent. Other families were filling in around her now, their excited chatter creating a buzz of anticipation. Margaret watched them, noting the easy confidence of military families, the way they navigated this world that still felt foreign to her. She wondered if any of them had stories of transformation, if any of them understood what it meant to completely reinvent yourself for love of your child. A group of elderly women sat down on the bench next to hers, their conversation drifting over about their grandson, who was also graduating today. They talked about family military traditions, about fathers and grandfathers who had served, about the pride they felt continuing their legacy. Margaret felt a pang of sadness that Danny didn't have that kind of heritage, but then reminded herself that he was creating his own legacy, building something entirely new. The morning grew warmer as more families arrived. Margaret could see the ceremony area filling up, rows of white chairs arranged in perfect formation facing a small stage with American and Navy flags flanking either side. Personnel in crisp uniforms moved efficiently around the area, making final preparations for the ceremony. Margaret checked her phone again. 9:40. 20 minutes until the ceremony began. She stood up from the bench and walked closer to the ceremony area, wanting to get a good view when Danny and his fellow graduates appeared. Her heart was beating faster now, anticipation and pride mixing with the underlying nervousness that had been her constant companion for years. She found a spot along the rope line that separated the ceremony area from the family viewing section. From here, she would have a perfect view when Danny received his trident pin. Margaret touched the small cross necklace she wore, a habit she had developed whenever she felt overwhelmed with emotion. The necklace had been a gift from the church community that had welcomed her when she first arrived in Phoenix, another symbol of her transformation. Behind her, Margaret could hear families sharing stories about their sailors, comparing notes about the training process, discussing their plans for celebrating after the ceremony. She wished she had someone to share these moments with, but Margaret had deliberately kept her social circle small over the years. Trust didn't come easily to someone who had lived her early life, and she had always prioritized Danny's safety and security over her own social needs. The sound of marching feet in the distance announced the approach of the graduating class. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she strained to see over the heads of other spectators. Somewhere in that formation was Danny, about to achieve something she had never dared dream possible when she was living in East Los Angeles. As the graduates came into view, Margaret scanned their faces frantically, looking for her son among the sea of identical uniforms and serious expressions. These young men had been through something extraordinary together, forged into warriors through months of the most demanding training imaginable. Soon, Danny would be one of them officially. The ceremony was about to begin, and Margaret felt her heart swelling with pride and anticipation. Everything she had sacrificed, every challenge she had overcome, every difficult decision she had made over the past 25 years had led to this moment. Her son was about to become a Navy SEAL, and she was here to witness it. Margaret Williams, formerly Rosa Martinez of the East Side Kings, stood among the crowd of proud military families and prepared to watch her son achieve the impossible. The small rose tattoo on her wrist caught the morning sunlight, a faded reminder of how far they had both come. The graduating class marched onto the ceremony grounds with precision that took Margaret's breath away. 32 young men moved as one unit, their boots hitting the pavement in perfect synchronization. Margaret's eyes darted across their faces until she spotted Danny in the third row, his jaw set with determination and pride radiating from his posture. Rear Admiral James Morrison stepped up to the podium, his impressive array of ribbons and medals catching the morning light. At 61, Morrison commanded respect through his presence alone. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, and his uniform was immaculate. This man had seen combat in 3 different theaters, earned his trident pin 38 years ago, and risen through the ranks to become one of the most respected leaders in naval special warfare. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Morrison's voice carried clearly across the assembly without amplification. Today we gather to witness something extraordinary. These 32 men have completed one of the most demanding training programs in the world. They have proven themselves worthy of joining the ranks of America's elite warriors. Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes as she listened to the Admiral's words. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and she knew that Danny had earned his place among these elite warriors through sheer determination and the values she had worked so hard to instill in him. The journey to this moment, Admiral Morrison continued, began months ago with over 200 candidates. Physical training pushed these men beyond their perceived limitations. Mental challenges tested their resolve under extreme stress. Character evaluation revealed who possessed the moral courage necessary to serve as guardians of freedom. The ceremony proceeded with military precision. One by one, the graduates' names were called, and they stepped forward to receive their trident pins from Admiral Morrison. Margaret watched anxiously as they worked through the alphabet, knowing that Danny's name would come toward the end. When Seaman Williams, Daniel J., echoed across the grounds, Margaret's heart nearly exploded with pride. Danny stepped forward with confidence, his back straight and his eyes focused ahead. Admiral Morrison pinned the golden trident to Danny's uniform, then shook his hand and spoke briefly to him. Margaret wished she could hear what the Admiral was saying, but the distance made it impossible. After the last graduate received his trident, Admiral Morrison returned to the podium for closing remarks. These men will deploy around the world to defend American interests and protect innocent lives. They carry with them not only their training and equipment, but the hopes and prayers of their families. The sacrifices made by military families often go unrecognized, but they are essential to our success. As the Admiral spoke about family sacrifice, Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was proud beyond words, but she also felt the weight of her secret past pressing on her shoulders. Would these families accept her if they knew who she used to be? Would the Admiral himself treat Danny differently if he discovered his mother's background? The ceremony concluded with the traditional cake-cutting ceremony. The eldest graduate and the youngest graduate jointly cut the first piece of cake, symbolizing the brotherhood that now bound all 32 men together. Families were then invited to join their graduates for refreshments and congratulations. Margaret made her way through the crowd toward Danny, her heart pounding with excitement and nervousness. When she spotted him talking with several other graduates and their families, she hesitated for a moment. These people all seemed so comfortable, so naturally part of this military world that still felt foreign to her. "Mom!" Danny spotted her and broke away from his group, striding over with a huge grin on his face. He swept her up in a bear hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "I can't believe you're actually here. This means everything to me. Danny, I'm so proud of you." Margaret managed through her tears. "I knew you could do it, but seeing it actually happen..." She couldn't finish the sentence, overwhelmed by emotion. "Come on, I want you to meet some people," Danny said, keeping his arm around her shoulders as he guided her toward his group. "Guys, this is my mom, Margaret Williams. Mom, these are some of my teammates." The introductions blurred together as Margaret met Danny's fellow graduates and their families. Everyone was friendly and welcoming, asking about her drive from Phoenix and sharing their own stories about the training experience. Margaret found herself relaxing slightly, realizing that these people were simply proud families celebrating their son's achievements. "Mrs. Williams?" A deep voice behind her made Margaret turn around. Admiral Morrison stood there, his imposing presence even more striking up close. "I wanted to personally congratulate you on Danny's graduation. He's an exceptional young man." "Thank you, Admiral," Margaret replied, hoping her nervousness didn't show at her voice. "This is the proudest day of my life. Danny spoke about you frequently during training," the Admiral continued. "He told me about your sacrifices to give him opportunities, about how you worked multiple jobs to put yourself through college. That kind of dedication and determination clearly runs in the family." Margaret felt her cheeks flush with surprise and gratitude. "He's always been focused and driven. I just tried to support him however I could." Admiral Morrison's expression grew more serious. "Raising a future SEAL as a single mother requires extraordinary strength and character. I have tremendous respect for what you've accomplished." As the Admiral spoke, his eyes briefly glanced down at Margaret's hands, where she was nervously adjusting her bracelet. The movement caused her sleeve to ride up slightly, exposing the faded rose tattoo on her wrist. For just a moment, the Admiral's eyes fixed on the tattoo, and Margaret saw something flicker across his expression. Margaret quickly pulled her sleeve down, but she was certain the Admiral had seen the tattoo. Her heart began racing as she wondered what he was thinking. Did he recognize the significance of the design? Did he understand what it meant? "If you'll excuse me," Admiral Morrison said politely, "I need to speak with some other families." "Congratulations again, Mrs. Williams. Danny is lucky to have you as his mother." As the Admiral walked away, Margaret felt a chill despite the warm California sunshine. She was probably being paranoid, but something about the way he had looked at her tattoo made her uncomfortable. After 25 years of looking over her shoulder, Margaret had developed sharp instincts about when people were suspicious of her. "Mom, are you okay?" Danny asked, noticing her sudden change in demeanor. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Margaret replied, forcing a smile, just overwhelmed by everything. This is a big day. The celebration continued around them, but Margaret found it difficult to concentrate on the conversations. She kept glancing around, looking for Admiral Morrison, wondering if he was watching her or asking questions about her background. Her paranoia was probably unfounded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed new life was somehow under scrutiny. Danny introduced her to more families, and Margaret did her best to engage in small talk about the training program and their sons' futures. Several mothers shared stories about their own military backgrounds or their family's traditions of service. Margaret listened politely, but felt increasingly like an outsider pretending to belong in a world where she didn't fit. Mrs. Williams, a woman named Patricia, approached her during a lull in conversation. "I'm Tom Bradley's mother. Our sons went through training together, and Tom mentioned that Danny talks about you all the time. He says you're his hero." Margaret felt tears threatening again. "That's very kind of him to say. I know it couldn't have been easy raising a boy like Danny on your own," Patricia continued. "My husband was deployed so much when Tom was growing up that I practically raised him alone too. These boys require so much energy and attention." "Danny made it easy," Margaret replied honestly. "He's always been focused on doing the right thing." As they talked, Margaret noticed Admiral Morrison in her peripheral vision, speaking with a small group of officers near the refreshment table. He glanced in her direction several times, and each time Margaret felt her anxiety increase. She was being ridiculous, she told herself. The Admiral was probably just being polite, making sure all the families were enjoying themselves. But years of survival instinct were hard to ignore. Margaret had spent too many years learning to read people's intentions, watching for signs of suspicion or danger. The Admiral's brief focus on her tattoo had triggered those old warning systems. "Danny," Margaret said quietly when Patricia moved on to talk with another family, "I think I'm going to head back to my hotel soon. It's been a long day, and I have an early flight tomorrow." "Already?" Danny looked disappointed. "I was hoping we could have dinner together. I want to show you around the base, maybe walk on the beach." Margaret wavered, torn between her desire to spend more time with Danny and her growing discomfort about the Admiral's attention. "Maybe we could do a quick walk, and then I'll head back." They said goodbye to Danny's teammates and their families with promises to stay in touch and arrangements for future visits. Margaret was genuinely touched by how warmly everyone had welcomed her, which made her paranoia feel even more unreasonable. As they walked toward the beach, Danny talked excitedly about his upcoming assignments and training opportunities. Margaret tried to focus on his words, but she couldn't shake the image of Admiral Morrison's expression when he noticed her tattoo. "Mom, you seem distracted," Danny said as they reached the sandy beach that bordered the base. "Is everything okay? You're not disappointed in me or anything, are you?" "Disappointed?" Margaret stopped walking and turned to face her son. "Danny, I have never been more proud of anything in my entire life. You've achieved something incredible today. Then what's wrong? You seem nervous ever since we talked to Admiral Morrison." Margaret looked at her son's concerned face and felt a wave of love wash over her. Danny had worked so hard to reach this moment, and her own baggage shouldn't cloud his achievement. Whatever the Admiral was thinking about her tattoo, it didn't change what Danny had accomplished. "I guess I'm just overwhelmed," she said, which was partially true. "This whole military world is new to me, and meeting such important people makes me nervous." Danny smiled and put his arm around her shoulders. "Mom, you belong here as much as anyone. More than most people. Actually, you sacrificed everything to make this possible." They walked along the beach in comfortable silence, watching the waves roll in from the Pacific Ocean. Margaret tried to push her worries aside and focus on this perfect moment with her son. Whatever challenges lay ahead, today was about celebrating Danny's achievement and the future he was building. But as they walked, Margaret couldn't completely suppress the nagging feeling that Admiral Morrison's brief glance at her tattoo might have consequences she couldn't yet imagine. The past had a way of reaching into the present at the most unexpected moments, and Margaret had learned never to underestimate the power of small details to unravel carefully constructed new lives. For now, though, she was determined to enjoy this time with Danny and worry about whatever came next when it actually arrived. 25 years of successful hiding had taught her that most fears never materialized, and she hoped this would be another false alarm. As the sun climbed higher in the California sky, mother and son continued their walk along the beach, celebrating a dream achieved and hoping the future would be as bright as this perfect morning. Margaret returned to her hotel that evening with her mind still racing from the day's events. The small room at the Hampton Inn felt cramped after the expansive beauty of the naval base, but it provided the solitude she needed to process everything that had happened. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone and debating whether to call her friend Elena back in Phoenix. Elena Rodriguez had been Margaret's closest friend for 15 years, one of the few people who knew pieces of Margaret's story, though not the complete truth. They had met at the community center where Margaret volunteered tutoring adult learners in basic literacy. Elena worked as a social worker for the county, and their friendship had developed slowly over shared coffee breaks and conversations about their work with disadvantaged communities. Margaret had told Elena that she was a widow who had moved to Phoenix to escape painful memories in Los Angeles. The story wasn't entirely false. Rosa Martinez had died in that hospital bed 25 years ago, making Margaret Williams a kind of widow to her former self. Elena had never pushed for details, understanding that some people needed to leave their past behind. "Elena, it's Margaret," she said when her friend answered on the second ring. "I wanted to let you know that Danny's graduation went beautifully." "Margaret, I'm so happy to hear from you. Tell me everything. How did our boy look in his uniform?" Elena had watched Danny grow up during his teenage years, had been there for his high school graduation and his departure for boot camp. She understood how much this achievement meant to Margaret, though she didn't know the full context of why success mattered so much to this particular mother and son. "He looked incredible, Elena. So proud and strong and capable. I almost couldn't believe I was looking at the same little boy who used to sit at our kitchen table doing homework. And how did you feel? Were you nervous being around all those military families?" Margaret paused, considering how much to share. It was intimidating at first, but everyone was very welcoming. Danny introduced me to his classmates and their families, and they made me feel included. "That sounds wonderful. You deserve to feel proud, Margaret. After everything you've done for that boy, you earned the right to enjoy his success." "There was one moment that made me uncomfortable," Margaret found herself saying. "The Admiral who ran the ceremony noticed my tattoo when we were talking. It was probably nothing, but he seemed to study it for a moment." Elena was quiet for several seconds. In their 15 years of friendship, Margaret had never mentioned having a tattoo. "I didn't know you had a tattoo. What kind is it?" "Just a small rose on my wrist. I got it when I was young and stupid. It's faded now, barely noticeable unless you're looking for it. I'm sure the Admiral sees hundreds of people every month. A small tattoo wouldn't mean anything to him, especially something as innocent as a rose." Margaret wanted to tell Elena that the rose wasn't innocent at all, that it had been earned through violence, and mark her as property of one of Los Angeles's most dangerous gangs. But those words had never been spoken aloud, not even to her closest friend. "You're probably right. I think I'm just paranoid because this whole military world is so new to me." They talked for another 20 minutes about Danny's future assignments and Margaret's plans for the trip home. After hanging up, Margaret felt somewhat better, but still couldn't shake the memory of Admiral Morrison's expression when he spotted her tattoo. She had researched gang tattoos years ago during her college criminology classes, part of her social work degree preparation. Rose tattoos were common among several California gangs, but the specific design and placement of hers was distinctive to the East Side Kings. Someone with military intelligence experience or law enforcement background might recognize the significance. Margaret tried to push these thoughts aside as she prepared for bed. Tomorrow she would fly back to Phoenix, return her job at the Family Services Center, and resume the quiet life she had built. Danny would begin his career as a Navy SEAL, and they would both move forward from this perfect day. But sleep didn't come easily. Margaret found herself staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with Admiral Morrison, analyzing his expressions and words for hidden meanings. The flight to Phoenix was uneventful, and by afternoon she was back in her small apartment, unpacking her suitcase and preparing to return to work the following day. Life resumed its normal rhythm over the next 2 weeks. Margaret returned to her job coordinating services for at-risk families, a position that felt like her true calling after her own experiences with transformation and second chances. She spoke with Danny several times, hearing about his integration into his new unit and his excitement about upcoming training opportunities. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late August, mixed in with her usual collection of bills and advertisements. The return address showed Naval Special Warfare Command, and Margaret's heart immediately began racing. She set the envelope on her kitchen table and stared at it for several minutes before working up the courage to open it. Dear Mrs. Williams, the letter began in Admiral Morrison's distinctive handwriting. I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to follow up on our conversation during Danny's graduation ceremony, particularly regarding some questions that arose after our meeting. Margaret's hands began trembling as she continued reading. I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you privately about some matters that may be relevant to Danny's security clearance and future assignments. I will be in Phoenix next week for meetings at Luke Air Force Base and wondered if we might arrange to meet for coffee. The letter concluded with Admiral Morrison's direct phone number and a request that she call him at her earliest convenience. Margaret set the letter down and walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the peaceful suburban neighborhood she had called home for over 2 decades. Her first instinct was to run. She could quit her job, liquidate her savings, and disappear again. Witness protection had given her the skills to create new identities and start over. But Danny's career would be destroyed if his mother suddenly vanished without explanation. His security clearance would be revoked, and questions would follow him throughout his military service. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed the number from the letter before she could change her mind. Admiral Morrison's office, a crisp female voice answered. This is Margaret Williams. The Admiral asked me to call. Please hold for Admiral Morrison, Mrs. Williams. After what felt like an eternity, the Admiral's familiar voice came on the line. Mrs. Williams, thank you for calling so promptly. I hope my letter didn't cause you unnecessary concern. Admiral, I have to be honest. I'm very worried about why you want to meet with me. I understand your concern, and I want to assure you that this conversation is not meant to be threatening or accusatory. However, there are some questions about your background that need to be addressed for Danny's sake. Margaret closed her eyes, knowing that this moment had been inevitable for 25 years. What kind of questions? The kind that require a face-to-face conversation in a private setting. I can meet you anywhere you're comfortable, your choice of location and time. Margaret thought about her options. Running would destroy Danny's future. Lying would likely make things worse if the Admiral already had information about her past. The only remaining choice was honesty, something she hadn't attempted in over 2 decades. There's a coffee shop called Desert Grounds on Camelback Road. It's usually quiet in the afternoons. Would Tuesday at 2 o'clock work for you? That works perfectly. Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that my primary concern is Danny's welfare and career. This conversation is meant to address potential issues before they become problems. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her kitchen for over an hour, staring at the letter and trying to prepare herself for a conversation she had hoped would never happen. Everything she had built, every sacrifice she had made, every careful choice over the past 25 years had led to this moment. She thought about calling Elena, but what could she possibly say? She considered calling Danny, but she couldn't burden him with this situation when he was just beginning his SEAL career. For the first time in many years, Margaret Williams felt completely alone. That evening, Margaret sat at the same kitchen table where she had studied for her college classes and helped Danny with his homework throughout his childhood. She pulled out a legal pad and began writing down everything she could remember about her time with the East Side Kings. If Admiral Morrison wanted the truth, she would give it to him completely and hope that her honesty might somehow protect Danny's future. The rose tattoo on her wrist seemed to throb as she wrote, as if the ink was reminding her that some marks never completely fade. Rosa Martinez had been buried for 25 years, but apparently her ghost was about to resurface. Margaret wrote late into the night, documenting her transformation from gang member to witness protection participant to single mother to college graduate to social worker. She included details about Danny's father, about the violence she had witnessed, about the choices she had made to escape that life. When she finished, the legal pad contained 12 pages of her most carefully guarded secrets. On Tuesday morning, Margaret called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. She spent the morning reviewing her notes and trying to anticipate Admiral Morrison's questions. By 1:30, she was sitting in Desert Grounds coffee shop, nursing a cup of tea and watching the door for the Admiral's arrival. Admiral Morrison entered the coffee shop at exactly 2 o'clock, wearing civilian clothes that somehow made him seem even more imposing than his dress uniform. He was a man accustomed to command, and that authority radiated from him even in casual clothing. "Mrs. Williams," he said, extending his hand as he approached her table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Admiral Morrison, can I get you something to drink? Coffee black would be great." Margaret returned from the counter with his coffee, her heart pounding as she prepared for a conversation that would either save or destroy everything she had built. The Admiral studied her face as she sat down, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Williams, I'm going to be direct with you because I believe honesty serves both our interests. I had your background investigated after our meeting at Danny's graduation." Margaret felt the room spinning slightly, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "What did you find?" Margaret Williams appeared in the system 25 years ago with very little prior history. Rosa Martinez, on the other hand, has a much more detailed record. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret realized that lying was no longer an option, if it ever had been. Admiral Morrison already knew who she used to be. "What do you want to know?" she asked quietly. Admiral Morrison set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret's face with the careful attention of someone who had interrogated enemy combatants and evaluated countless personnel for security clearances. "I know she entered witness protection after providing testimony that resulted in the conviction of 17 gang members, including 3 leaders of the organization. I know that Rosa Martinez legally died when Margaret Williams was born in Phoenix, Arizona." The Admiral's words were delivered without emotion, but Margaret felt each one like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed new life was being dissected with clinical precision. "I also know," Admiral Morrison continued, "that Margaret Williams put herself through college while raising a son as a single mother, earned a degree in social work, and has spent the last 15 years helping at-risk families escape cycles of poverty and violence. Her professional record is exemplary, and her son has become one of the finest young warriors I've ever had the privilege to train." Margaret looked up, surprised by the admiration in the Admiral's voice. "I don't understand. Are you threatening me or complimenting me?" "I'm trying to understand you," Admiral Morrison replied. "Mrs. Williams, in my experience, people don't make the kind of transformation you've made without extraordinary motivation and character. I've seen gang members who got out and stayed out, but I've never seen anyone accomplish what you've accomplished." "I had Danny," Margaret said simply. "He gave me a reason to become someone better." Admiral Morrison pulled a thin folder from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table between them. "This contains everything the military knows about Rosa Martinez and Margaret Williams. I want you to read through it and then tell me your story in your own words." Margaret opened the folder with trembling hands. The first document was her original booking photo from 1989, taken after an arrest for drug possession that had been dropped when she agreed to become an informant. She barely recognized the angry, defiant young woman staring back at her from the photograph. The next several pages detailed her involvement with the East Side Kings, including her relationship with Carlos Mendoza, Danny's father. There were surveillance photos, police reports, and FBI debriefings from her time as an informant. The final section contained documentation of her transformation, college transcripts, employment records, volunteer activities, and character references. "This is my life," Margaret said quietly, closing the folder. "All of it, the good and the terrible. Tell me about the night you decided to leave," Admiral Morrison said. "The shooting that killed Maria Santos." Margaret felt tears threatening as she remembered that horrible night. "Maria was my best friend, the only person in the gang who really understood me. We were driving home from a party when a car pulled up next to us and started shooting. I never found out if they were targeting us specifically or if we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. You were hit in the shoulder and leg. The doctor said I almost died from blood loss. When I woke up in the hospital and saw Danny sleeping in the chair next to my bed, I realized that staying in that life was going to get him killed too. I couldn't let that happen." Admiral Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense. What made you decide to cooperate with law enforcement? That decision put you and Danny at enormous risk. Margaret had never spoken about this decision in detail, not even to the FBI agents who had debriefed her. Carlos abandoned me the moment he found out I was pregnant. The gang leadership made it clear that Danny and I were expendable if they needed scapegoats. I realized we meant nothing to them, but they had been everything to me. That betrayal gave me the motivation to burn it all down. The testimony you provided resulted in life sentences for 3 men and lengthy prison terms for 14 others. You essentially destroyed the East Side Kings as an organization. I hope so, Margaret said firmly. Every day those men stayed on the street. More kids like me would get pulled into that life. More families would be destroyed. More mothers would lose their children to violence. Admiral Morrison was quiet for several minutes, studying Margaret's face as she spoke. Mrs. Williams, I have to ask you a difficult question. Do you believe there's any possibility that your past could be used to compromise Danny's missions or endanger his teammates? Margaret had been dreading this question, but she had prepared for it. Admiral, the East Side Kings haven't existed as an organization for over 20 years. Most of the people who knew Rosa Martinez are dead or in prison. I've lived as Margaret Williams longer than I ever lived as Rosa Martinez. My past is buried so completely that your investigation is the first time anyone has connected those two identities. What about Danny? How much does he know about his background? Nothing, Margaret said without hesitation. As far as Danny knows, his father died in a construction accident when he was very young. He believes we moved to Phoenix for better opportunities. He has no idea that Rosa Martinez ever existed. Admiral Morrison nodded slowly. That creates a potential security vulnerability. If someone discovered the truth and threatened to expose it to Danny, you might be susceptible to blackmail. Margaret considered this possibility, something that had kept her awake countless nights over the years. Admiral, I've been preparing for 25 years to tell Danny the truth if necessary. I hoped it would never be required, but I'm ready to have that conversation if it means protecting his career. And how do you think he would react? Margaret smiled slightly, thinking of all the conversations she and Danny had had about moral courage and making difficult choices. He'll be shocked, certainly, but Danny understands sacrifice and second chances better than most people. He's seen me work with gang members and ex-convicts through my job. He knows that people can change if they're willing to do the work. Admiral Morrison finished his coffee and sat back in his chair, appearing to weigh everything Margaret had told him. Mrs. Williams, I'm going to be honest with you. This situation presents complications for Danny's security clearance and future assignments. Margaret felt her heart sinking, wondering if her past was about to destroy her son's dreams despite all her efforts to prevent exactly that outcome. However, the Admiral continued, I'm also incredibly impressed by what you've accomplished. The transformation from Rosa Martinez to Margaret Williams represents exactly the kind of character and determination we want to see in our warriors' families. What does that mean for Danny? It means I'm going to recommend that his security clearance be maintained, with the notation that family background has been thoroughly investigated and deemed acceptable. Your cooperation today, combined with your demonstrated character over the past 25 years, convinces me that you pose no security risk. Margaret felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Admiral, I can't tell you how much this means to me. Danny's career is everything to him. Mrs. Williams, I have one more question, and then I have something to tell you. Admiral Morrison's expression became more personal, less official. Do you regret the choices you made as Rosa Martinez? Margaret considered the question carefully. I regret the pain I caused and the lives that were lost. I regret that Danny will never have the opportunity to know his father. But I don't regret the path that brought me to witness protection, because that's what gave me the chance to become Margaret Williams and raise Danny to be the man he is today. That's exactly what I hoped you would say, Admiral Morrison replied. Mrs. Williams, I want to tell you something that's not in any official file. 28 years ago, I was a young SEAL team leader conducting operations in Central America. My team was betrayed by someone we trusted, and We walked into an ambush that killed 3 of my men. Margaret listened intently, wondering why the Admiral was sharing this personal story. I spent years hunting for the person who betrayed us, consumed by anger and a desire for revenge. It nearly destroyed my career and my marriage. Finally, my commanding officer told me that I could either let that betrayal define the rest of my life, or I could choose to honor my fallen teammates by becoming the best leader I could be. Admiral Morrison paused, meeting Margaret's eyes directly. I learned that our past mistakes and tragedies don't define us unless we let them. What defines us is how we choose to move forward, how we use our experiences to serve something greater than ourselves. Danny doesn't know about my past, Margaret said. Should I tell him? That's your decision to make, Mrs. Williams. But I will say this. Danny's already benefited from your experiences, even though he doesn't know it. The values you've instilled in him, the strength you've demonstrated, the sacrifices you've made, all of that came from the wisdom you gained through your transformation. Admiral Morrison stood up, extending his hand to Margaret. Mrs. Williams, it has been an honor to meet you. Danny is lucky to have you as his mother, and the Navy is fortunate to have him as a SEAL. Admiral, there's one more thing I need to ask. Will anyone else need to know about this investigation? The file will be classified and restricted to a very small number of people with legitimate need to know. As far as the Navy is concerned, Margaret Williams is exactly who she appears to be, an exemplary military mother who raised an outstanding warrior. As Admiral Morrison prepared to leave, he turned back to Margaret one final time. Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that what you accomplished, leaving that life, protecting your son, building a new identity, and using your experiences to help others, that takes more courage than most people possess. Rosa Martinez made mistakes, but Margaret Williams is a hero. After the Admiral left, Margaret sat in the coffee shop for another hour, processing everything that had happened. The weight of 25 years of secrecy had been lifted from her shoulders, and for the first time since leaving Los Angeles, she felt truly free. That evening, Margaret called Danny to share some news about her day, though not the complete truth. Danny, I had an interesting conversation today with Admiral Morrison. He wanted to follow up about the graduation ceremony. Really? What did he want to talk about? He was asking about our family background for your security clearance documentation. I think he was impressed by our story. Our story? Danny sounded curious. What did you tell him? Margaret chose her words carefully. I told him about how we built our life in Phoenix, about the sacrifices we made to achieve our goals, about the importance of second chances and hard work. Mom, sometimes I feel like there's more to our story than you've told me. Not that I need to know everything, but I sense there are chapters you've kept to yourself. Margaret felt her heart racing, wondering if this was the moment to finally tell Danny the complete truth. Danny, there are things about my past that I've never discussed with you. Someday, when the time is right, I'd like to share that story with you. I trust you, Mom. When you're ready to tell me, I'll be ready to listen. But I want you to know that nothing could ever change how I feel about you or how grateful I am for everything you've done for me. After hanging up, Margaret walked to her bathroom mirror and looked at her reflection for a long time. She rolled up her sleeve and studied the faded rose tattoo on her wrist, the mark that had nearly destroyed everything she had built. But today, for the first time in 25 years, Margaret Williams was no longer afraid of Rosa Martinez. The past had been acknowledged, evaluated, and accepted. Admiral Morrison had seen the complete truth and declared her worthy of standing among military families. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed Elena's number. Elena, it's me. Do you have time to talk? I have something important to tell you about my past, something I've never shared with anyone. As Margaret began to speak the truth about Rosa Martinez for the second time that day, she felt the final chains of her old life falling away. The transformation that had begun 25 years ago in a hospital bed was finally complete. Margaret Williams was free to move forward into the future, carrying the wisdom of her past without being imprisoned by it. Her son was a Navy SEAL, her secret was safe, and her new life was built on a foundation solid enough to withstand the truth. The small rose tattoo on her wrist would always be there, a permanent reminder of where she came from. But now, Instead of a mark of shame, it had become a symbol of survival, transformation, and the incredible distance one woman could travel when motivated by love for her child.